Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, our teacher is Anne Gleig, who is an associate professor of religion and cultural studies at the University of Central Florida. She is the author of American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity, and she is currently working on a collaborative book with Amy Langenberg on sexual misconduct and abuse in contemporary Buddhism, which is under advanced contract with Yale University Press. And so I give you Anne.
Oh, great. Well, good morning, everyone. I just wanted to start off by thanking everyone for the invitation. I think it was Daigen Gaither. I don't think he's here today, but I think he'd recommended me. And then Chris has been taking care of me, and we've had a few back and forths. So I'm speaking today from Orlando. You can probably tell that I'm not a Floridian. I'm actually from Liverpool. In England. I'm sure you know. Some of my undergraduate students don't always know. So I am actually a scholar of Buddhism and also a practitioner of Buddhism. I started practicing about 30 years ago as a teenager, and I've practiced mostly in the Insight tradition and also in the Tibetan Nyingma tradition. So I have a kind of insider-outsider kind of approach. Today I'm going to talk more about my academic work, but I'll hopefully make it, more personal, not dry. Some academic work can be a bit kind of dull and heavy. My idea was that I would talk for about 30, maybe 35 minutes, and then we could just, do a nice Q&A together. So I hope that works for everyone. I'm going to talk about three topics that are close to my heart. So I'm going to talk about queer Buddhism, racial justice in Buddhism, and Buddhism itself. Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone was able to read my article, but I'd provided an article to Chris in case it was of interest, and essentially, it was looking at the relationship between LGBTQI identified Buddhists, Buddhists who identify more, on the LGBT side, and Buddhists who identify more on the queer side. And I was kind of interested in differences between those Buddhists. So I'll just kind of talk you through the article and what I found. So the article was published in the Journal of Religion and Sexuality, and it's called Queering Buddhism or Buddhist Dequeering. So it's kind of playing on these two different kinds of movements that can happen in gay Buddhist sanghas and kind of asking like what accounts for these differences. So I essentially open the piece by noting that some Buddhist scholars who themselves identified as gay Buddhists, one of whom I think that some of you may know. I was quite excited to start with this quote from Roger Corliss because I know that he was involved with your group. And essentially what Roger was, I never met Roger, but I feel quite close to him because he was also from Merseyside. So, somehow these two, Liverpudlian Merseyside people, me and Roger, ended up becoming Buddhist professors in America and gay Buddhist professors. So I felt like there was a little karma there. So Roger basically, wrote about the possibility of a kind of queer kind of enlivening and a kind of queer revisioning of Buddhism. And he claimed that queer consciousness was actually more aligned with the essence of the Buddha Dharma than the kind of traditional patriarchal norms that, Buddhism has traditionally been articulated through very patriarchal monastic elites. And so Roger was kind of saying, young, old, queers of all ages are going to really shake up the Dharma in the West. Now, this is really exciting. Like, I love his work, and I feel that, this is something, that I've always wanted to do. But actually, what some academics found who went and then studied gay Buddhist groups actually didn't confirm Roger's, kind of vision. So a couple of academic studies were done. One of them was by Andrew Yip, who's also a gay man, and Sharon Smith. It's an article in this book. And they actually found, they studied a group of Buddhists in the UK, and they actually found that LGBT Buddhists were not radical, and they weren't queer in the Dharma, as Roger had suggested. They were actually more assimilating to heterosexuality. So they were actually kind of doing the opposite, and that's a play on the queer and Buddhist or Buddhist dequeering. Now, there was another study done in the US by a sociologist called Wendy Cage. She looked at a group an insight group in Massachusetts. I always struggle with that city name, that state name. But she found the same. She found that gay Buddhists really assimilated and didn't really celebrate their gayness. So essentially, on the one hand, we've got Roger saying queer Buddhism can be this radical, thing that frees the Dharma from patriarchy. But then on the other, we have actual gay Buddhists who are far from freeing the Buddhism from patriarchy, are themselves assimilating to heteronormative norms. So there was this gap that I really wanted to study. That was I was wanting to account for that gap at the start of my research. So essentially, as I was thinking about the gap, I thought about what kind of differences there could be between, the broad category of gay Buddhists, within that spectrum. And I was especially interested, as I said, in this distinction between gay identified people who really preferred the signifiers lesbian, gay, bisexual, or gay identified Buddhists who like the signifier queer. So just as a little kind of explanation on the difference between those two from an academic perspective, obviously everyone here has their own lived experience, and I in no way want to erase that. So I just want to kind of give you a bit of info about how scholarship thinks about these differences. So essentially, within kind of academia, scholars distinguish between LGBT studies and identity, and queer theory studies and identity. On the side of the LGBT studies, so first of all, as an academic discipline, it was the first. It came before queer studies. It really, basically started to emerge in the 1970s. And it was really about recovering, gay people who had been lost, or not just lost, but excluded from history. It tended to have an understanding of sexuality of what we call in the academy essentialist. So if you are an essentialist, you believe something is its essential nature. It's always been like that. It always will be that. It's innately or inherently so. So when applied to sexuality, one good example of this would be the born that way, right? That gay people are born gay, that there's no shifts, no really authentic shifts in their sexual identity. And it tends to rest on a binary between heterosexuality and homosexuality. So it's a kind of what we call a binary kind of way of approaching organizing human sexuality. Its kind of mission generally in the political sphere is assimilation. It tends to associate with liberal goals of tolerance and privacy, and essentially the kind of approach of gay people are just like straight people and we just want straight people's rights. Now queer theory comes later and in many ways is a kind of critique. It's both a kind of continuation, it owes a lot. Queer theory is based on LGBT studies and owes a lot to LGBT studies, and that's important to acknowledge, right, that debt of gratitude. But it's also a critique as well. It's very uncomfortable with essential ideas. And so the opposite in the Academy of Essentialism is constructivism. And that just means that things are contingent, impermanent. You might hear some start kind of noticing the Buddhist similarities, right? Contingent, impermanent, dependent upon causes and conditions. That's essentially constructivism. And that when causes and conditions change, the product will change. It's very anti-binary. So in that sense, it's we could say in Buddhist terms, it's about non-duality. So it aims to disrupt kind of any kind of oppositional categories. Politically, it's aligned with radical change. So it's not like, hey, we just want to become part of the system that's excluding us. It's more like we need to smash that system. We need to totally disrupt it. And rather than being associated with liberalism, tolerance and privacy, it really celebrates difference. So essentially what I was really interested in thinking about this body of knowledge around these different ways to be gay in a way, or to think about gayness. I was really interested in whether Roger's queer Buddhism mapped on to this more LGBT Buddhist who really emphasize these values, and the Buddhists that tend to assimilate, that Sharon, Andrew and Wendy found, would be more fallen into the other column, more the kind of liberal types. So essentially I wanted to test this thesis out in real life. So I'm an ethnographer. That's my training in academia. And essentially what ethnographers do is that they go into religious communities. They join religious communities. I mean, if they're working on, if religious studies ethnographies and, goes to all kinds of communities, but they go to communities. Often they join the community. They spend time, from anything from 3 months to 3 years. And they do this thing called participant observation. So they participate, but they're also taking notes and observing. And they also do a lot of interviews, and they try and discover, what's going on in the community and then relate it to academic theory. So essentially I wanted to do this project, and I did do this project with a community that was very close to my own heart, which is just down the road from you all. Some of you may be familiar with it, hopefully. So the East Bay Meditation Center started in 2007 in Oakland. Now, in 2008, I had a girlfriend I was living in Houston at the time doing my graduate work, but I had a girlfriend in San Francisco. So I used to always spend my summers in San Francisco. And in 2008, I went to the East Bay Meditation Center for the first time. And it totally blew my mind. Because I think I must have been, I'm 48 now. My maths is terrible. 74. I was about 30. No, I was a bit older. I was about 34. And I've been going to Buddhist communities since I was 15. So, but in all of that time from age, 15 to age 34, I'd never really been around other queer Buddhists. I'd always been, the odd lesbian, or, a couple of lesbians. And so it really, really impacted me. It really impacted me to bring these two worlds that I'd kind of been separate in my life. It's like I had my Buddhist life and my scholarly life. And then I had like my queer life. And I never really knew fully how to bring them together. And so for me, going to the East Bay, it was a very deeply integrative personal experience. It brought my Buddhist, intellectual, and sexual worlds together. So I really, really, loved it. And I thought, I'll do an ethnography. I'll do a study of the East Bay. And then I can think about these different, these differences between gay Buddhists and try and make sense of them. So just a little background on the East Bay. As I say, it was started in 2007. One of the founders of the East Bay is Larry Yang, who you may know. Larry has become a really dear friend of mine. He's an Asian American gay man who has made a tremendous impact on Buddhism in America. And one of the things that made the East Bay really special was that it was really one of the very first, actually maybe the first actual group with a physical location of its own that started from the very start with a primary commitment to inclusivity and diversity. So this was kind of symbolized by the fact that the co-organizers told me when I interviewed them that before they put anything else up on the altar, before they even put the Buddha statue down, they put the LGBT flag. This is from the very first center. I think the altar's probably changed now. Hopefully they've got the pride flag with the trans symbol. But they put this up first to symbolize that even before thinking about being a Buddhist center, they were thinking about being an inclusive center. As you can see, this inclusivity includes both queer, gay, LGBTQI inclusivity. It also includes racial diversity. So there's a photo here of Martin Luther King Jr., obviously I'm sure you recognize him, and also Banti, who was actually the first African-American monastic in the US. He died a few years ago, unfortunately. And then they were also very concerned with gender representation. So they made sure to put a female and a male representation of, the Buddha on the altar. So this really gives a sense of what is EBMC all about. It's about gender inclusivity, racial inclusivity, sexual inclusivity, class inclusivity, because it was in Oakland, a center that, it was a center where people could get access to it. A lot of the teachers from EBMC came from Spirit Rock. Some of you may have been to Spirit Rock. It's really hard to get to Spirit Rock if you haven't got a car. So I didn't have a car for like 10 years. I didn't drive when I first came to the States. The States is, if you haven't got a car, it's like, welcome to the class system in the US. So having a center, just down the road from the BART also really signaled economic and class inclusivity. Now the group here's a current, not current, but a more recent, picture of the teachers. So it just gives you a sense of the diversity represented in the teacher body. Also super important. Now the group I was really focused on for my ethnography is still called the Alphabet Sangha. And I think it was on, when I was going, I think it was on Thursday nights, but that might have changed. Now, essentially what was really interesting about this group to me was that J.D. Doyle, who started the group, had originally been practicing in a lesbian Buddhist group in Berkeley. But JD wanted to start a new group because they were kind of troubled by the whiteness and I guess the middle classness of the lesbian group. So in many ways, for JD, the Berkeley lesbian group was more like the the type of gay Buddhist group that was more about assimilating to the kind of racial norms of whiteness and the norms of, liberal norms of, the class system. So JD was really looking to start a more queer, intersectional, radical group. And the Alphabet Sangha was the second group that started at EBMC. When EBM started in 2007, they started first with a POC only affinity, with a general group open to the wider Sangha, the Mahasangha, I think it's called, and then a POC affinity group. And then the Alphabet Sangha group started really shortly afterwards. Now, I went to the Alphabet Sangha I spent like 3 summers that I'd go to, I'd escape Texas, which was really great to escape, and lived in the Bay Area. And so I'd attend as a practitioner. And then I spent, I think, a 3rd or a 4th summer with my scholar hat on and did, ethnography. And so I did a lot of voluntary work. I just really tried to immerse myself in the culture of the center. And I also interviewed, I think, 20 or 22 practitioners there. Now, what I found in my interviews is the following. So first of all, I found that to make EBMC queer, like how to keep it as a queer space, right? How to not kind of let it kind of move into that heteronormative kind of stream, was that they had to be super intentional with their strategies. So they had to do very specific practical things. So the first was that they had to say, look, first and foremost, we have to think of diversity, inclusivity, and equity as the number one commitment. If we only think about Buddhism, the center will just reproduce itself as a white center and as a more kind of heteronormative, maybe gay, but still heteronormatively leaning liberal center. The second thing was that they committed to always having a queer teacher, however they identified on the LGBTQAI spectrum. And they also committed to always having one teacher of color as well lead the Sangha. And this actually, was actually quite difficult. They turned down some really big name teachers who were like, hey, can we come over from Spirit Rock to teach? While they recognize, thanks, it's a nice intention, they also only let people teach who they felt really embodied the values that they were trying to, nurture. They created this very, safe container through policies on registration. So making sure there was a good racial demographic balance, making sure there was a good gender balance. They would always have someone on the door welcoming new people with a badge, with your name and your preferred pronouns. So again, just a lot of really careful thinking about how can we cultivate this as a safe queer space. And then during the Dharma talks, the teachers would always integrate the teachings of the Dharma with what specific experiences as a queer gay person. Speaking from personal experience is kind of a hallmark of the Insight community. So they really wanted to continue that, but make sure that experience spoke specifically to the gay identities and the range of gay identities, the racialized gay identities, transgender identities in the room. So that's the first thing that I found, as this is what kept the space queer. Now, the second thing that I found was I was really interested in how do people who go to the Alphabet Sangha, how do they relate their Buddhism, their practice, to their queer life? And I found some major themes that I kind of pulled out of the interviews. So first, a very strong theme was that the people at the Alphabet Sangha felt like that as queer people, as queer identified people, they really understood dukkha. Like they really understood the teaching of suffering, because for them, suffering, which is, there's 3 levels of dukkha: suffering, pain, the suffering of impermanence, and the suffering of anicca, no self. So for them, they really talked about this first level of dukkha, the dukkha of dukkha, that it's hard to be gay. It's hard to be queer in this world, right? The second theme that came out was they felt that as queer people, that they had really had to deconstruct the normative notions of identity, assumptions of, heterosexuality, and also really assumptions of normative gender identity. So they actually really saw they talked about it a lot about like queer identity or, gender queer or non-binary identity is like it's a kind of doorway into the Dharma. So they were like, we get the Dharma. It's like intuitive to us. So that's kind of like what Roger was saying, right? That queer people, like there's a natural affinity. They also, broke down these different levels of dukkha, like impermanence. So, someone I interviewed who was transgender said, for me, going through the process of transitioning was like a very immediate and first person experience of the Buddhist teachings of impermanence. That, my gender identity, which seemed very solid at birth, assigned a gender identity at birth, seems very solid, that, they'd had to, move beyond that solidity. So they talked a lot about impermanence as this very direct, immediate experience. The same with no self, the fluidity of self. And also they talked about emptiness and non-duality in a similar way as non-self. So impermanence, anicca, anatta, no self, and non-duality are all philosophical concepts that we'd call in scholarship about constructivist philosophies of contingency and change. So you can really see there's this really nice fit between queerness and Buddhism on a kind of philosophical level, as well as, this lived experience. Now, one other thing that I was really interested, having spent quite a bit of time in the Bay Area myself and, really experiencing it as a sex positive place, very different than, England. When I came to the US for the first, San Francisco, California for the first time, I really felt my English kind of prudenish, and like I'd grown up Catholic, so I was really repressed, so it was like, wow, sex positivity. So I was interested in how, the Alphabet Sangha members thought about sexuality and desire in Buddhism in relationship to sex positivity. And this is what I found. So I wanted to just highlight, the tension, a tension between Buddhism and sex positivity. So here's just a little, shot of sex positivity. And then I pulled this very famous quote. You're probably all familiar with it. It's a sadhana. Basically, there's a monk who, he becomes a monk, and then his wife and his family are really pissed off with him. Pardon my language. They're really upset with him because they want a son. They want a son to pass on the family wealth. So essentially he becomes a monk, but then he agrees that he'll have sex with his wife. And in the sutta, it's not because he's like still into his wife. It's just that it's like he feels he has to do his duty and produce an heir. So he has sex. And then the Buddha finds out and really, kind of shouts at him. And in his, he's getting chastised by the Buddha, and the Buddha says, this famous quote about, put your penis into a snake. That would be better for you than into a woman's vagina. So again, I was just like, how are you as lived Buddhists, like putting these two very different ideas of sex together? And what I found was these 5 major themes. So first of all, most of the people at the Sangha that I interviewed they all said that they were all converts, right? They weren't born into Buddhist families. And they said they were drawn to Buddhism because they felt it was less sexually moralistic than Christianity. That's a very common theme actually in Buddhist converts. The second thing they said was that they actually really found that Buddhist teachings on craving, that like more, just a little bit more, they've actually found that really helpful in them kind of getting clear about their motivations in their like sex and dating lives. So they found it brought more intentionality. And they also kind of tended to focus not on the types of sexual acts, whether that be, whatever, there was a range of sexual activity represented. There were people there who are, work in dungeons that are really into legacy, and there's people who are, more like, monogamously gay. I mean, it was everything was there. But what they all agreed on was it wasn't what you did. It was kind of how you did it, like what mind kind of you brought to it. Many of them felt mindfulness. This is similar to the teaching on craving. They felt as a practice, it made them more conscious and present. And so they were less likely to act selfishly, to treat other people like objects for their own gratification. Like they felt it cultivated a non-harm towards their sexual partners. And then when we talk together about, when I said, yeah, but, it does actually say this act is problematic in the Tibetan commentary. So when I pulled out a specific act, they were like, well, that isn't really essential to Buddhism. That's just more like Tibetan culture. So they did this move between this is culture that we don't have to worry about and take seriously. And this is Dharma, which is our practice. Sorry, I'll just try and wrap this up in sec. So good timing. So in my conclusion in the article and in my research, these are the conclusions that I came from. That within this broad category of Western gay Buddhists, there are actually significant differences. Like we can't really talk about the Western gay Buddhists. We can only talk about Buddhists, right? And that what I found in relationship to the other studies, Roger's work, Jeffrey Hopkins is another scholar practitioner you may be familiar with, Wendy Cage's work and Andrew and Sharon's work, we found actually that white middle-class men, especially, but not cisgendered identified men, but not exclusively also cisgendered women, that they tended to assimilate. They tended to completely downplay their sexuality or their gender identity and fit into the norms of the dominant heterosexual group. Queer identified Buddhists, on the other hand, they went the queer Dharma way. They were more subversive, more radical. And they really stress that we have to think about race, we have to think about class, and we have to think about gender and disabilities and other vectors of difference, as well as sexual orientation. Like that's what queerness means to them, not just being, queer sexuality, but queer politics on a more intersectional level. So what I concluded was that it's not really your sexual orientation that makes you queer. It's really about difference, how you value or not value difference. That really makes you either queer Buddhist, or de-queer Buddhism, to get back to those, questions that I opened the article with. So it wasn't really surprising to me. I just want to bring your community back into the convo. So essentially, this one, the revolution, will be intersectional, or it won't be revolutionary. You might have heard it. It's quite a common slogan. So this is like a queer intersectional politic. And it really aligns here with the East Bay Meditation Center. So you can see that alliance that I hope is, quite clear. And then I was also thinking, well, what about your group? Are you more like assimilative, or are you more like queer? And I got into you can tell me, but I got onto your website and I was really struck by this image that, brings together racial justice, Buddhism, and gay and sexuality. You probably know it more than me because it's your group. But again, I opened up the thing and I was really personally happy and kind of moved to see that your group is really embracing that kind of intersectional approach to Buddhism. So I think that you are queering Buddhism, but you can tell me what you think as well.
I had a question. My name is Ron.
Hi, Ron.
Whenever I looked at sort of early versions of constructivist or postmodern or critical theory, it really seemed like they were parroting Buddhism in some ways. So I was just wondering if you could just talk about how you see how Buddhism might have influenced, certain key Buddhist concepts might have influenced those theories.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. It's a really good one. So I'll start with something, a personal, actually, reflection. So when I was 18, I left Liverpool, I went to Bristol University, and I came out as gay, and I was living in a women-only household. It was like a Greenham Common women's household. So all the women were a bit older than me in the house. And I remember I was, a second year theology student. And I remember a friend of one of the women's came round, and she was a philosopher, and she was telling me all about postmodernism. And and she was going on about, all the postmodern thinkers and queer theory and stuff. And I said exactly the same. I said, well, that sounds just like Buddhism. I immediately made that same, link that you did. So I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in terms of philosophical systems, there is a lot of crossover. Now, in terms of also parallels, I'm going to just take a step back. So one of the kind of prevalent philosophies at the time of the Buddha was Advaita Vedanta. It's a Hindu philosophy. And it basically posited that there was an essential self, right, that was kind of trapped in samsara, the Atman. And that the goal, we were trapped in samsara, and the goal, like liberation, they call it moksha in Hinduism, was, freeing this Atman. So it was an essentialist philosophy. And then the Buddha kind of spoke to the Advaita Vedanta philosophers. It wasn't called Advaita Vedanta, but it's what it became institutionally, Advaita Vedanta, and basically said, no, there's no self. That was the Buddha's contribution. So the Buddha was like an early constructivist who was speaking to the essentialists of his day. And in the same way, queer theorists were doing the same, right? They were talking to they talked to the essentialists of their day. So I think there's structurally those two parallels. In terms of specific connections, a famous philosopher of queer a kind of famous post-structuralist philosopher who is very popular in queer theory is Michel Foucault, who you may be aware of. And Foucault was very impressed by Zen Buddhism, actually. He wrote about Zen. He saw it as he was really into cultivating the self, practices that produce different types of selves. And he saw in Zen Buddhism, a possible model to aspire to. We do know of that specific connection between Foucault and Buddhism, but his interest in Buddhism seems to come after his initial work on his initial work, which is constructivist. So it didn't cause that work, but I think it was, an example of someone who was thinking across those two worlds. Eve Sedgwick, who is, considered one of the kind of, originators of queer theory, was also interested in Buddhism as well. So I wouldn't say, as far as I know, there's no direct links between queer theorists who were into Buddhism and then they got into queer theory. But we do have this documented interest between queer theorists like Eve Sedgwick and Foucault and their interest in Buddhism, where they're saying, oh yeah, and like this and that. So is that helpful? I lost you. There you are.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was also just thinking even when Buddhist ideas entered into Western thought in the 1890s to 1920s, if it seemed even pre-theory?
Well, the earliest kind of encounters between Buddhism and modernity actually happen in Asia in the mid-19th century. The major Western thinkers, so that the Buddhists are influenced by, are more the kind of Protestant thinkers and the Romantic thinkers, who the Protestant thinkers tend to, and the Enlightened and the Romantic thinkers tend to lean more to essentialist ideas than constructivists. So the early kind of is more, we call it like Protestant Buddhism. So I'd say, and like Western psychology, William James was a huge influence and a huge kind of cultural broker. So no one's coming to mind, but it is possible that I'm forgetting someone or missing someone. Thanks so much for that question.
Thomas?
Hi, Thomas.
Hi, Anne. Thanks so much for your great talk. Grisha, in the interest of time, I'd really like to hear from Cass first, and then you can come back to me.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you for a great talk. This is really wonderful, inspiring, and thanks for especially starting off with Roger Corliss, who is a great friend and member of our Sangha. Very inspiring to us. I was always struck by what Harry Hay, a founder of the Mattachine Society and the Radical Fairies, used to say. That was, the assimilationists think we're the same as heterosexuals except for what we do in bed. And he said, we're different from them except for what we do in bed. And that the way to liberation was to throw off the ugly green frog skin of heteronormativity and let our own, essential natures come through. So I'm definitely in that camp. When I used to travel a little bit, I would always look for a queer sangha wherever I went, and I didn't find a lot. So I'm curious if you have, in your research, have found that they're fairly widespread, or how are there a lot of them?
Well, yeah. Well, thanks for that. Lifting up Harry. It was Harry Hunt.
Harry Hay.
Harry Hay. Sorry, because I know that Roger was really. He talks about Harry Hay in his work on queer dharmology. So I really appreciate that. Nod to the ancestor. So like you, I also, never found, gay Buddhist groups. Really my first gay Buddhist group that I found was the East Bay Meditation Center in 2007. However, since then, I'd say since a bit later, maybe like the last 6 or 7, 8 years, I feel like there started to be a kind of explosion of both POC affinity groups and LGBTQIA affinity groups across, at least as far as I know, in North America. There's also an emergent network in some of the South Asian countries. I actually could send some links if you want. There's more, more groups becoming public. I think for, every cultural context is different with different concerns around privacy and security and safety. But there's also the same in Europe. And this year there was the first official queer or LGBTQI, I'm not sure what signifier they use, conference. And that happened, it was the first international one, sorry. And I know that there were groups represented from North America, Asia, and Europe, a few European countries, people and groups. That developed out of, I think, Sakyadhita, which is the women's Buddhist organization. And I think it happened about 2 months ago. I actually had a conflict. It was the same time as the Western Dharma's teacher, so I actually couldn't attend. But it was a German nun who kind of organized it. So I think there is, I think there is emerging, and I think it's becoming more of a network, the groups are kind of networking in. And I think one of the things that's helped that is Zoom becoming more accessible and people, becoming more used to Zoom because of COVID. It's like one of the very, maybe the only slightly good thing that's come out of COVID. So if you want, I don't know if you're interested, but I could send you the link to that group. And I think they're tracking, groups that want to be public. So I think it's changing, which is great for younger, I'm thinking of, the generations will come after us, hopefully. Thank you. Thomas?
Hey, thank you so much. I feel like you just took us on an analytical tour of the neighborhood. So we feel, now we get a better sense of where we fit in. Because some of us have been to these other places, but not through your lens. And so it's really, really helpful. I'm just speaking from myself, but over the past 15 years participating with GBF, I think this is something we have really struggled with is, how do we break out of that sort of assimilative, way of being? And we've been around for 25 years or more. So, it sort of speaks to where we came from. And, I have to say we do fit into that white middle class, bracket. So it's not surprising. That's something we have struggled with and we continue to. I appreciate your kind words about what we have on the website. We are revamping our website. It will include that statement, and other stuff as well. But so I would really like to we get questions all the time on, do you know of a place in New Zealand or any sanghas over here? So if you have curated any lists or hubs or directories, we would love to get that and include it on our website.
Yep. I'll find it.
Thank you so much. And then secondly, the slides that you presented are really helpful. And I think, it would help your talk, which is only going to be audio, but we are converting over to a podcast format and there will be a page for each speaker. I would love it if we could get your slides and attach them.
I'd be happy to share anything that I've got.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I did want to just say, it is, about I just wanted to respond to your comment about being, white and middle class. I think that, one of the things that I learned, through working with the East Bay now for, a really long time, 15 years or something. I'm working a lot on racial justice and obviously I don't know if it's obvious, but I'm white and I'm from a working class background, but I'm middle class now because I'm a professor. So, what I've learned is, the same as you. I mean, it's like, it takes a lot to break whiteness, and I think that Larry Yang always talks. He says that it's very hard for centers to retrofit diversity. I don't know if that's the right word, retrofit. No, it's like it has to be at the beginning, because if you start as a white organization and, academia is also so white as well. And I haven't actually in this issue now with the project that I'm working on. If you don't think about diversity from the very beginning, it gets harder and harder to break the culture of normativity, the class and the race culture, and so you do have to do these very intentional things. I mean, it's just a lot of it's a process, it's a practice of love and dedication, because it's a lot of work and, it's very humbling. You kind of get like, you realize your limits, you realize how conditioned you are as a white person. And, but I'm really appreciate that you're thinking about it seriously as an organization. So I, as a Buddhist, think it's important to, also affirm intention as well as, structural processes. So thank you.
We have a few more minutes, Chris, and then Jim.
Anne, thank you so much for this talk. I was looking at your book online on the ebook version, and I finally ordered it because it's so much detail. There is so much information on that. So I have two questions. First of all, you honored your grandma, Anne, and your mom, Anne, at the beginning of the book, and I wondered about what that lineage was all about. And then number two is, this book could be a 10-class series because there's so much information, especially just the turn of this last century and the modernity and the movements that we all felt, both in the Vipassana movement and in modern Zen with Suzuki Roshi. Those were really actually modern movements that came to us. So we were already adopting sort of this new stream through. So where do you teach your classes? And then what about grandma? Or you said Nan? And it's so nice to hear the Beatles accent too. Our whole experience has been the Beatles speaking that Liverpoolian. So I heard a lot of that.
Well, that's such a lovely question. Thank you. So, we just, like in Liverpool, you call your grandma your nan. It's just like what everyone calls their grandma. So yeah, essentially, my nan was Annie. She got called Annie Walters. She was first generation Irish immigrant. And then she had 5 kids and one of them was a girl, was Anne. And so then my mum had 5 kids, Catholics. And I was a baby, you can probably tell. And she called me Anne. So like my nan's dead now, but when, we were always known as like the 3 Annies. And me nan had a very, very harsh childhood. She was orphaned. She had one sibling who got put into a mental institution. I mean, like just now I realize, wow, what intense levels of trauma, that she had. And my mum left school when she was 15. She was a cleaner. She was a bar person. But she was great at telling stories. She is great at telling stories. And she always said that she wanted to write a book about my nan. But she's never been able to do it. So when I wrote my first book, I really wanted it to be an honouring of my mum and my nan, So I was thinking about lineage. And I think also that's something that's like something really important to acknowledge, like lineage in every way. Like we always come from others. We're dependent on others. So that's where the 3 Annies came from. It's really sweet. Thank you for highlighting that. And then American Dharma, it's like a massive project. Thank you for buying it. I really appreciate that. I've got a shorter article on it. I'll send the link for others who might not be able to afford the book. But I teach classes in my university. And, if people invite me to a centre, I come and give a talk. So thank you for that. I'll try and kind of fit Jim in. Is it okay to take? I'm fine to stay. Is it okay to? Yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Unmute, Jim.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. As a rabid anti-deconstructionist English major who feels that the whole theory of deconstruction has destroyed the study of humanities in American university. But that aside, I just also think it's telling that but I'm also very much into the sense of fluid sexual identity. Our Sangha, to a huge extent, is composed of men who survived the AIDS epidemic. And that was the massive dukkha of our lives. And I just think it's part of history that things come in waves. And I applaud the new generation's emphasis on more things. I just think it's human nature that the new generation does things differently. And anyway, that's all I have to say. I appreciate your study and your remarks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I just want to say, Jim, that I really appreciate you, honouring the memory of those that you lost, friends, lovers, and I really feel touched. And I think that one of the things that personally saddens me in progressive politics is, again, I think often there's not enough respect for lineage, and, sometimes younger folk are more radical or, I think we all the generations have different insights and different sufferings, and our suffering should be the places that we connect and, learn from. So again, really want to honour the share, and I hope for, more friendships between generations of gay, queers, progressives in general.
Thank you so much. That's a very generous way to end. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let's actually have one more for Zenki. That'll be the last one. And then if you're okay to stay on for a few minutes for more questions, we'll close. And then can you hang out for a little while?
Yeah, I can stay for a little.
All right, go ahead, Zenki.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. And, it was pretty enlightening in terms of the assimilation, the assimilators versus the deconstructionists. That was very interesting. And just to kind of piggyback on Jim's comment, what I was thinking the whole time and relating to it personally was that I was wondering if you saw age as a determinator of what group people went into. It seemed to me personally, just from my own history as a Zen Buddhist, I've always identified as queer and gay, or however you want to say it. I'm just a gay man, and but I'm an old hippie, and so of course I found myself identifying more as the assimilator, because when I did get into Zen Buddhism, there was so much I had to learn about being a Zen Buddhist and what that means and how you practice it, et cetera, et cetera. And the centers that I practiced in were, I didn't see them as queer and straight. I saw them as Zen Buddhists, and I had to get with the program. I needed to learn, exactly what I needed to do and when to bow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, after 25 years of that, and in the center that I practice in now, it is a patriarchal center, although there's lots of gay people in the Sangha. And so what I'm finding is I'm probably going to have to do a subgroup of the gay and lesbian and LGBT, et cetera, people, to kind of get us all together and do some more inclusivity works in that way. But do you see age as the determining factor between the two groups?
Well, it's definitely, there is yes and no, I'd say. It's kind of, in the book American Dharma, I've got a whole chapter on Gen X teachers from the Garrison conference. There was this conference that there was the first kind of intentional expression of Gen X teachers as distinct from Boomer teachers. So the Gen X teachers kind of define themselves almost in opposition to the Boomer teachers. So you definitely do find, have found within my work, these kind of generational identities, like the Boomers are like this, the Gen Xers are like this, the Millennials, and who's younger than the Millennials? I can't keep up the Gen Ys. And the generations do have a sense of themselves. So on one level as categories, yes. But on another level, there's always individual disruptions. Like Larry Yang is a Boomer teacher. A lot of the work that's booming now around racial justice is because of the efforts of, Boomer generation Buddhists of color and their white allies that, laid the groundwork for, teachers like Lama Rod Owen, who are probably more famous, for being gay Buddhists. So I think there are generational, kind of patterns, but within every generation, I think you also find the range within, like the Radical Fairies, that was a super queer group, so again, it's always in academia, you working with categories, and the categories are helpful, the patterns are helpful, but in terms of lived experience, you also want to nuance it and be sure to know within the age groups, there's also that range. So I'll just say that for now.
Excellent. Thank you, Anne, so much. Many people would like to get copies of your slides and your article and links to different things. So if you can, I can save the chat and harvest the emails for you. And then if you can send them to me or send them to Chris, we'll forward them on to the whole Sangha. Yeah, that would be fine. Okay. I can stay for like 10 minutes or so if anyone's like dying to ask something. Okay, well, we have to do our announcements and things, and then so now's the time for announcements. Anne's talk event, thanks to George Hubbard. Thank you, George. Yeah, George. Will be available on the website. I put a link here. We have recordings to many past talks you can access there. The GVF newsletter is also available online. We'll have a new one soon. And I would like to just mention Dana, the Pali word for generosity. And when you donate to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, then you help us pay honorariums for speakers, rent for the meeting space on Zoom or on Bartlett Street, which we will hopefully return to soon, and pays for the quarterly newsletter, which goes out to many incarcerated gay Buddhists. And next week, the speaker is Bill Weber. Bill is a senior Vipassana practitioner and a graduate from Spirit Rock's Community Dharma Leaders Program. He's 25 years of extensive retreat practice and currently practices at home with his husband or sits with a small group of gay men. He is also a documentary filmmaker and a video editor whose latest projects are To Be Takai, I don't know how to say that, and The Untold Tales of Armistead Motley. Any other announcements from the group? Yes, Jeff.
I just want to remind folks that we are reopening next Sunday for in-person meetings. And some of us are very excited about that. Everybody, please wear your mask, be vaccinated, and enjoy the Sangha, however you prefer. And also that we still welcome people who would like to be sort of in a group of available volunteers for individual projects. Occasionally we have things. It wouldn't be an ongoing necessarily, but on call, so to speak. So let us know if that appeals to you. Thank you.
Any other announcements? Okay, Anne, do you have a dedication of merit that you like to use, or would you like us to use our GBF dedication of merit?
Use yours.
All right. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Grisha. Thank you, George.
Anybody have questions for Anne before we sign off, before she runs out the door?
Thanks, everyone.
Anne, thank you for a great talk. I'm obviously of the boomer generation, and I want the perspective. It seems, one person brought up the age, and it does seem developmentally appropriate in some way that, over time people have become more queer.
I think, did we lose Jeff?
Yeah, we did. I think his connection. Oh no, there he is. Jeff, you went.
Yeah. Basically, I wonder. There's tends to be the assimilative group and the, I would say, deconstructive poles of things, and I'm wondering, interested in how we can integrate those, and because it's not anti-affinity group, I don't think, or anti-anything.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. One thing that I've learned from working, with racial justice, Buddhist Sanghas, affinity groups, and the larger white Sangha that they take place in, is, there is a portion of people who are anti-affinity groups who think it's, going against the Dharma, and, so not talking about them. But then there's a general, Sangha that kind of likes the idea, they want to be supportive, but they're a bit clueless. They don't really know how, but they're not against it. They're for it in principle and intention. So essentially, I found two things in my research that are the most important. The first is for white practitioners to do their own work around their conditioning as white people. So, that often involves doing a white affinity group, which is, there's different, trainings, but one is White Awake. There's a few curriculums out there. The San Francisco Zen Center's running a white awareness group. So I think that white people, doing their own work, is like, in terms of like the alphabet Sangha at EBMC, racial diversity and racial awareness is like huge primary. So for white gay Buddhists to, make that kind of connection, I think, need to like, take on their own whiteness. And the second thing that I found was building actual friendships, So at one center I looked at, they kind of realized that, there was a real gap between like the white people and the people of color. So they started I think they called it an affinity friendship group, where like a small group of mixed race group and mixed genders, mixed sexual orientations, committed to like, it was quite long. It was like 3 or 4 years meeting like, every 3 months, but really just getting to know each other as people. But they were doing that at the same time as they were doing like the white awareness work. So, I'd say personal friendship, relationship building, and also doing your work as a white person would be two things that come up. And I do think just in general, like I'm really into like intergenerational relationships personally. So that's another thing that we need to get better at,
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah. Grant?
Hi. Thank you for speaking. I appreciate this so much. So for some context, I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm currently getting my master's in fine art. And my thesis is revolving around the intersections between spiritualism, but specifically Buddhism and queerness. And so I wonder if you have any advice on, we're talking about, like, I guess, power dynamics and embracing diversity. And I seem to be hitting this wall where I'm like pretty fresh into Buddhism. I talk to people, and like all the people in my life who relate to Buddhism in any way tend to be Asian. And, they're skeptical of me, reasonably. But so they're always like, you need to talk to people that are Asian that are Buddhist or Indian or, things like that. But I've also found at the same time, the spaces I've come to here, like I was just earlier today in a Sangha that was Chinese, and they were teaching homosexuality is against Buddhism, all those kind of things. And so I'm just having a hard time, and May specifically since you're a professor in regards to writing a thesis, but if you have advice on how to approach those kind of differences that seem to be cultural differences in a way that respects the other culture and isn't hegemonious, but at the same time is like staying true to yourself, defending yourself.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the ways that scholars talk about Buddhism in America is, they talk about convert groups, and they talk about heritage groups. It's become problematized, but it was known as the two Buddhas typology. Now, one of the reasons that is problematic is because there's a lot of different types of convert groups. So some convert groups are, historically have been super white. And other convert groups like Soka Gakkai, for example, have been very racially and class diverse. And then, of course, there's tremendous differences within Asian American heritage groups. And then there are a lot of groups that kind of, mix the two categories, so they have, converts, they have, all types of converts. They have Asian Americans who are converts to Buddhism, who've grown up within the tradition, so converts not necessarily white is what I'm saying. So there's actually quite a lot of literature in Buddhist studies around that kind of, the different types of groups. And there's literature on the ways in which those groups have been kind of put into relation, have been related to each other in racist ways, you know, that like the Asian American heritage groups are really conservative and patriarchal, and the white groups are really liberal, and that's also not true. So I really appreciate the sensitivity that you're kind of showing. One book I will definitely recommend that came out recently is called Be the Refuge. It's a must read for you. It's by a kind of scholar practitioner of Buddhism called Chensing Han. And that's basically celebrating the diversity of Asian American Buddhists. And it also talks about, you know, queer Asian American Buddhists who, you know, maybe also have wrestled with some of the gender or sexual conservatism in their, like, you know, home communities. So I think that would be a book that really opens up, you know, thinking around these categories in a way. I think that will be helpful for you. You know, I can see you trying to navigate, like, how can I be, you know, essentially not racist and respectful to Asian Buddhist communities, but also, you know, if I'm, you know, navigate homophobia in a way that's not harmful to myself. So I think that, you know, you just want to avoid, you know, equating, you know, like, for example, the Buddhist Churches of America this is in my article at the end, but the Buddhist Churches of America is a Japanese Pure Land group. They were the first community to build a Buddhist they were the first Buddhist organization in the US. And they were the first Buddhist groups to affirm gay marriage. Like, the first Buddhist gay marriage happened in a heritage community. So that's also a community that kind of disrupts that kind of white liberal Asian, you know, conservative kind of binary as well. So it's a bit complicated, but I think if you read Chensing Han's book, and also if you read my book, I don't want to, like, you know, sell myself.
I don't know the name, by the way. I'm like fresh to this group.
Okay, so my book's called American Dharma, but it's got a lot of references in because it's a kind of like, it's kind of looking, it's got like what scholarship said about Buddhism in America, and specifically Buddhism, convert Buddhism. How is that being harmful to Asian American heritage groups, and what's happening now? So it's just a good reference book is what I'm trying to say. For study, it'll be really helpful.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Great. Okay. So I'm going to log off now. All right. Well, take care, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Anne.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
See you all next week.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.